Hi, my name is Chuck Cobb. I'm the author of The Project Manager's Guide to Mastering Agile. That will be the third book I've published to date on Agile project management, and I've also published two earlier books on business excellence. However, I want to assure you that I'm not just an academic book author. I have over 20 years of hands-on experience as a practicing project manager in a very broad range of industries and application areas. Welcome to my training course on Learn the Truth About Agile versus Waterfall. This course is designed to help you see these two seemingly disparate approaches in a fresh new perspective as complementary to each other rather than competitive. This slide shows where this course fits into the overall Agile project management roadmap that I've developed. I have developed a total of 7 courses in this series on Agile project management. This is the first course in that series, and it serves as a primer to all of the other courses. The overall curriculum provides a very complete Agile project management training program that is designed around enabling a project manager to successfully blend an Agile and traditional plan-driven project management approach in the right proportions to fit any given situation. In addition to these 7 primary courses, there is an optional course that is designed to supplement these courses called How to Prepare for PMI-ACP Certification. That course is designed specifically for anyone who wants to use these courses for PMI-ACP certification. It is also a great way to review the material in the primary 7 courses and tie it all together, even if you have no interest in PMI-ACP certification. Any student who completes the overall curriculum of all 7 of these courses will receive a signed completion certificate from the Agile Project Management Academy, similar to the one shown here. You will find significant discounts on all of these courses in the bonus materials at the end of the course. Before we get into the course, I want to tell you that I'm passionate about the information I teach, and I'm committed to help my students get the most out of all my courses. I want to encourage you to fully participate in the course by first posting discussion topics and participating in discussions that you think might be of general interest to other students. That's a great way to get more out of the course and to share your experiences with others. The second way to get the most out of the course is to contact me directly if you have any questions or if I can be of help in any way. This course is called Learn the Truth About Agile versus Waterfall and is designed to help you learn to bridge the gap between these two seemingly competitive approaches and to get the best of both of these two worlds. Although the exact numbers from various surveys are open to discussion, there is no question that Agile has become the latest management trend of today, and it is much more than just a fad. It is really here to stay, and the rate of adoption of Agile methodologies has increased significantly since 2009. A Forrester study from 2009 observed that 35% of organizations used Agile. By 2013, a study by Actuation Consulting showed that the adoption rate of Agile had grown to over 70%, which is more than double what was observed in the 2009 survey. Like many new things, Agile is becoming a hot new buzzword, and everyone wants to jump on the Agile bandwagon without necessarily fully understanding why they're getting into it and exactly what they expect to get out of it. It reminds me a lot of when Six Sigma was hot in the 1990s and early 2000s. In those days, Six Sigma was what we called the program du jour, and there was a lot of hype about it, and everyone wanted to jump on the Six Sigma bandwagon. Several patterns were apparent at that time. There was a lot of hoopla, like green belts and black belts associated with Six Sigma. A lot of people got lost in the mechanics of doing Six Sigma, and people tended to think of Six Sigma as a panacea for any problem that a business could have, and they tended to regard all other previous process improvement methodologies as obsolete and passé. A similar thing is happening with Agile today. While Agile has huge potential for a business, I think it's important not to get lost in some of the hype that exists about Agile and objectively understand the differences between an Agile approach and a traditional project management approach, and the benefits and limitations of each. Just becoming Agile is not necessarily the most important goal in itself, depending on the nature of the business that you're in. We need to take time to understand what problem Agile will potentially solve and how it will benefit your business. Many businesses and project managers have an existing management system and a project management approach that is based on a traditional plan-driven approach, or what is sometimes called Waterfall, and are faced with a choice of continuing to use a traditional heavily control-oriented and plan-driven approach, which has an emphasis on managing costs and schedules that may be constraining the business, or a more agile approach which can offer many benefits, including faster time to market with higher business value. However, there's also a risk associated with losing control of projects with less focus on managing costs and schedules. Many people see this as a binary and mutually exclusive choice between two extremes. I want to show you how to get the best of both of these two worlds. The fundamental problem is that because many people see this as a binary and mutually exclusive choice, they make the mistake of attempting to force-fit their projects and business environment to one of these extremes, and that can cause a lot of confusion and consternation because it often doesn't result in a good fit. The result is probably not an optimal solution, and it can often result in a mismatch that is very problematic. It's like attempting to plug an appliance requiring AC power into a DC outlet. The methodology may not be well suited to the project, and it might also not fit well with the company's business environment and culture. A better solution is to go in the other direction and fit the approach or combination of approaches to the project and to the business environment. That might require more skill, but it definitely can be done. My training courses are designed to help businesses and project managers develop the right skills to create a well-integrated approach to fit their business and project environments. The training curriculum and the 3 books I've written in this area are all very unique. There are a lot of books and training on Agile, as well as a lot of books and training on project management. What's unique about my books and training is that they are designed to help close the gap between the project management community and the Agile community to help people see Agile and traditional plan-driven project management approaches in a fresh new perspective as complementary to each other rather than competitive, and to help people see how to blend these two approaches together in the right proportions to fit a given situation to get the best of both worlds. The first problem we need to get past is that the terms Agile and Waterfall are used very loosely in actual practice. In the next section, we're going to discuss the definition of these terms, and the next lecture is What is Waterfall? When people talk about a true waterfall approach, they're typically talking about an approach that looks something like this. It typically starts by defining all the requirements for the project up front, and some form of change control is typically implemented to manage and limit changes to the requirements of the project once those requirements have been approved. The general approach is based on defining and stabilizing the requirements up front before the project starts to achieve a level of predictability and control over the project cost and schedule. In addition, the project may be broken up into sequential phases that may have phase gates to approve the transition from one phase to the next. It's called waterfall because the results of one phase flow into the next one, just like a waterfall. There were a number of serious problems inherent in the original waterfall process that even Dr. Royce, who originally created it in 1970, recognized. The first big problem was that any problem in the requirements of the design of the solution are many times not discovered until final testing, and the process for correcting errors found at that point could be very long and expensive. An equally serious problem is that attempting to control requirements of the project in order to manage the scope to stay within budget and cost schedule estimates can create a very inflexible approach that isn't responsive to changes. That might work well if you're in a highly predictable environment with a low level of uncertainty, but it doesn't work well in environments that are much more uncertain, where it is difficult or impossible for users to fully define the requirements for the project up front. There are also very limited opportunities for customer feedback and input until the final user acceptance testing at the very end of the project. In fact, in many cases, the customer doesn't even see what is being designed until the design and testing are already complete, and by that time it is very difficult, if not impossible, to make any significant changes. The impact of these problems is that there are many software development projects that may have met their cost and schedule goals, but failed to deliver the required business value. As I've mentioned, the waterfall approach has some significant inherent problems associated with it that even Dr. Royce recognized when he created it in 1970. More iterative project methodologies that broke up the project into incremental functionality for delivery, such as the Rational Unified Process, or RUP, and its variants, became much more widely used in the 1980s and 1990s. These iterative methodologies replaced the use of the original waterfall model in many software projects because they solved many of the problems in the original waterfall approach. It's ironic that iterative software development processes largely replaced the use of pure waterfall methodologies in the 1980s and 1990s, and a true waterfall approach isn't widely used anymore in many application areas, yet people still continue to use the word waterfall. That can be very misleading because it implies that there's a single discrete approach called waterfall that is still in wide use today, and that is not the case. In most cases, the term waterfall is used very loosely for any process that is not totally agile. The term agile has been almost as widely misused as the term waterfall. In the next section, we're going to discuss how the definition of the word agile has evolved and how it is commonly used today. Let me start with giving you a little background about what Agile is, because some of you may not be familiar with Agile. In simple terms, Agile is basically a new approach to project management that is much more flexible and adaptive than traditional plan-driven approaches to project management. Let's talk about how an Agile approach addresses the problems we previously discussed regarding the waterfall approach. First, an Agile approach is based on delivering functionality quickly in small increments and prioritizing the functionality based on business value rather than attempting to deliver the entire project all at once. The work to be done is broken up into short sprints of 2 to 4 weeks each, and at the end of each sprint, the product owner who represents the business reviews and accepts the deliverables. That provides an opportunity for quick and frequent feedback to keep the project on the right track to maximize the business value that is delivered. It also accelerates time to market, because some high-value components of the solution might be delivered early rather than waiting for the entire solution to be complete. Another way that Agile addresses these problems is that testing is integrated with development, and the entire project team owns responsibility for the quality of the products that they produce, rather than testing being done sequentially by an independent organization. That's a very proactive approach to build quality into the product, rather than a reactive approach to try to find and fix defects later. Finally, there's a significant difference in the way an Agile approach manages requirements. A traditional plan-driven project is based on a contractual approach to deliver a project meeting well-defined requirements within given cost and schedule goals. That works well in situations where the requirements can be defined up front and stabilized to avoid too much change, but it doesn't work well in environments that are much more uncertain, where it is much more difficult to define the requirements in detail up front. Agile is based on more of a partnership approach between the business users and the project team to work collaboratively to elaborate detailed requirements as the project progresses. That approach accelerates the startup time for projects and is much more likely to deliver projects that maximize the business value of the solutions. The exact benefits of an Agile approach are going to be somewhat different among different companies, but I've summarized here what I think are some of the most important general benefits of developing a more adaptive or Agile approach. First is adaptability. Many people make the mistake of using a one-size-fits-all approach for all projects, and that just doesn't work well in all situations. You need to be able to fit the methodology to the project, and Agile offers an alternative approach that is particularly well suited for projects that have very high levels of uncertainty. The next one is time to market. An Agile approach can improve time to market by accelerating the startup phase of the project, by deferring some of the upfront planning that might be done with a traditional project management approach. And using an iterative approach to deliver at least a portion of the solution as quickly as possible can also have a significant impact on accelerating the time to market. Third, in many situations, Agile and lean thinking in general offer the potential to reduce the costs and overhead associated with a project. By putting the emphasis on producing value as opposed to maximizing control, there's a lot of opportunity to reduce the cost of documentation and other overhead in the project. That's not to say that documentation and other forms of project control and administration are all bad things to do, but it is definitely good to take a hard look at those items and see if they really produce value and who they produce value for. The biggest advantage in many situations, as I've mentioned, in an Agile approach is higher customer satisfaction that results from producing solutions that are much more well aligned with customer needs by engaging customers more directly in the project to provide feedback and inputs as the project progresses, rather than relying heavily on documenting requirements upfront prior to the start of the project. Finally, a major indirect result of an Agile approach is that it offers the opportunity to have a significant positive impact on the culture of the whole organization by building a spirit of collaboration, trust, and shared responsibility within the organization. That can be a difficult thing to achieve, but the benefits are well worth it in terms of organizational synergy and productivity. Actuation Consulting's 2013 study reports that 86.9% of Agile users attribute higher profits to the adoption of Agile. In the next lesson, we're going to discuss some of the history of how Agile came about. As a result of these advantages, in the 1990s, a proliferation of new methodologies evolved to fill this need. In 2001, in reaction to the proliferation of methodologies that had developed, the Agile Manifesto was developed that defined 4 values and 12 principles that defined the essence of what Agile is. The 4 key values are as follows: individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. It's very important to recognize that all of these statements are intended to be relative statements and not absolutes. For example, individuals and interactions over processes and tools does not mean that there are no processes and tools in an Agile project. It means that the project relies more heavily on individual interactions to be more adaptive rather than being bound by a rigidly defined process and tools. Let me explain the concept of individuals and interactions over processes and tools a little further. In many traditional plan-driven processes like the Waterfall approach, the emphasis on control required people to follow a well-defined process. A more adaptive process requires you to control the process rather than the process controlling you. This kind of atmosphere is particularly important in an environment that requires creativity and innovation. In a similar way, working software over comprehensive documentation does not mean that there is no documentation in an Agile project. Many traditional plan-driven projects, and in particular the Waterfall process, can be very documentation intensive. For example, in a true Waterfall process, documentation is a required delivery at the end of each phase to show that you have successfully completed the requirements of that phase. Documentation in an Agile project should be used intelligently where it provides value, and documentation should never be an end in itself. Many times, online electronic tools that are designed to facilitate collaboration and communication take the place of hard copy documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation also does not mean that contracts are incompatible with an Agile approach. Very few people get a blank check to do an Agile project without any expectations of what the cost and schedule of the project will be, so there's generally some kind of need for managing customer expectations about costs and schedules. In a traditional plan-driven project, there is typically a contract with a customer to deliver a solution that meets the defined requirements within a cost and schedule. And naturally, to achieve that objective, the requirements need to be relatively fixed. In an Agile project, there is more of a spirit of partnership between the customer and the project team. Both sides acknowledge that the requirements are somewhat uncertain and are likely to be at least somewhat redefined or clarified as the project progresses. And both sides work collaboratively in a spirit of partnership and trust to develop a solution and manage cost and schedule trade-offs as the project progresses. Agile has been successfully used in a broad range of contracting situations, from fixed-price contracts to where the requirements for the contract deliverables are fairly well defined, to more loosely defined contracting situations where only the broad-based contract objectives are defined. The important thing is that the level of flexibility in the contract should be consistent with the nature of the requirements, and both sides need a mutual understanding of the level of uncertainty in the requirements and how the contract will be managed. Responding to change over following a plan does not mean that Agile projects are totally unplanned. A traditional plan-driven project attempts to develop a detailed plan for a project up front prior to the start of the project and attempts to control changes to that plan to manage the scope of the project as the project progresses. An example would be a construction project where there would be a fairly detailed plan for constructing a building prior to the start of construction. An Agile project doesn't attempt to do a detailed plan for the entire project up front prior to the start of the project. It uses more of a rolling wave planning process. Some level of planning is done up front based on the level of uncertainty in the project, but much of the detailed planning can be deferred until later in the project when more and better information will be available to make those decisions. It's similar to the kind of planning you might do for taking a vacation. When you plan a vacation, you don't typically plan what you're going to do down to the last detail for what you're going to do on every day that you're on vacation. You probably have at least some goals for the things you want to do that may or may not be rigid and cast in concrete, but there's typically some level of flexibility built into your plans to develop more detailed plans once you're on vacation and you have a better idea of what you want to do. Just as the term waterfall has been misused, the term Agile has also been widely misused. When people compare Agile to waterfall, it sounds like there's a single discrete methodology called Agile, and that is not the case. Agile has a much broader meaning and is really a way of thinking defined by the Agile Manifesto values and principles, rather than a single discrete methodology like Scrum. In the next lecture, we're going to discuss a general approach for choosing the right approach to fit a project. In this lesson, we're going to talk about choosing the right approach. There has been a pendulum effect in this area for a number of years. Agile started out as somewhat of a revolution by developers against project management controls associated with traditional waterfall methodologies that were perceived to be very cumbersome and bureaucratic. And that's how the comparison of Agile to waterfall started out. However, I believe that comparison is archaic in today's world and is no longer really relevant. Yet there are still many people who use that comparison, and they want to jump into Agile without necessarily fully understanding what they expect to get out of it. The first thing to recognize is that neither Agile or Waterfall are really individual discrete methodologies that can be compared, especially as if there were a binary and mutually exclusive choice between the two approaches. A much more accurate comparison is to think of a continuous spectrum of methodologies from heavily plan-driven at one extreme to heavily adaptive at the other extreme. Here's an example of how the comparison of Agile to Waterfall is misused. This statement says that, according to a 2012 Chaos report, Agile succeeds 3 times more often than Waterfall. I totally agree that Agile has huge benefits, but comparing Agile to Waterfall like this is totally misleading. It creates the impression that Agile totally replaces Waterfall, and Agile is good and Waterfall is bad, and that is not the case. Saying Agile is better than Waterfall is like saying a car is better than a boat. Each has advantages and disadvantages depending on the situation and the environment that you're in. Neither Agile or Waterfall is inherently good or bad. The problem comes up when you attempt to force-fit a project to one of them and it isn't a good fit. The level of uncertainty in a project is a major factor in choosing the right approach. If the level of uncertainty is relatively low, a traditional plan-driven approach based on a predictive control model may be very appropriate. Here's an extreme example. If I were building a bridge across a river, it would be ridiculous to say, we'll build the first span, see how that comes out, and then we'll decide how to build the remaining spans. That just doesn't make sense. Building a bridge is a relatively predictable kind of project and calls for much more of a plan-driven kind of approach. On the other hand, if the level of uncertainty is high, a traditional plan-driven approach doesn't work well, and a more agile or adaptive approach is probably needed. For example, what if I were to set out to find a cure for cancer? Would it make sense to try to develop a detailed plan for that effort? That would be equally ridiculous. There are just too many unknowns and uncertainties. You might develop a high-level plan based on what you do know and possibly some assumptions to test and validate, but most of the effort would be based on a trial-and-error approach, and the plan would evolve as you went along based on the results of those trials. In the next section of the course, we're going to go into some additional background information on Scrum, which is the most widely used Agile methodology. And we're also going to do a brief overview of how a hybrid process works that blends traditional plan-driven project management with Agile in the right proportions to fit a project. The next lesson is focused on what is Scrum. The roots of the Scrum methodology can be traced back to the new product development game, which was originally created in 1986 and was the first to use the analogy of a scrum in the sport of rugby to describe how a Scrum team works. The Scrum process was first used for a software development project at the Easel Corporation by Jeff Sutherland in 1993 and was then formalized by both Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland in 1995. In 2002, the Scrum Alliance was formed to guide further development of the methodology. In this lesson, we're going to talk about what is Scrum. Scrum is so widely used that many people associate the word Scrum with Agile. It's like saying Coke as a general name for soda pop. The purpose of this discussion is not to further confuse Scrum with the word Agile, but to show Scrum as an example of how an Agile development process works. Please keep in mind that this is only an example and not the only way an Agile process can work. This is only a very general high-level overview of Scrum. For those who would like to understand further detail about Scrum, some further detail is provided in another lecture. Scrum is an iterative process that breaks up a project into 2 to 4 week sprints. The important characteristics of a Scrum project are: each 2 to 4 week sprint is like a mini project. The goal of each sprint is to produce a working increment of software that has been fully tested at the end of each sprint. At the end of each sprint, the product owner reviews and accepts a working software similar to a user acceptance test, or UAT, in a full-scale project, and the team does a retrospective to evaluate how well the project worked in that sprint, similar to a post-mortem in a full-scale project. The word Scrum comes from the team sport of rugby. A scrum in rugby is a method of restarting play that involves players packing together closely with their heads down and attempting to gain possession of the ball. Because the work is broken into 2 to 4 week sprints instead of spread out over a long period of time, the feedback loop is immediate and rapid learning can take place as the project progresses. Scrum is adaptive in 2 ways. The first is solution adaptation. Scrum is adaptive in the sense of progressively defining the solution. You can start a Scrum project with only a very fuzzy idea of the requirements and progressively elaborate the requirements and the solution as the project proceeds to ultimately converge on a solution that meets the business need. The second is process adaptation. The process itself behind Scrum is also adaptive. A Scrum project is broken up into short, fixed-length intervals called sprints. At the end of each sprint, as the project progresses, the team determines if the process is working or needs to be further adapted to fit the nature of the problem. There's a popular stereotype that Agile projects do not use any process and are uncontrolled. That stereotype is also not accurate. Most Agile projects use Scrum, which is a very well-defined process. It's a different kind of process. It is much more empirical and adaptive rather than being rigid and prescriptive, but it is a very well-defined process. It's important to understand the distinction between a defined process and an empirical process. The Waterfall process and a number of other plan-driven processes use well-defined processes. The process doesn't change significantly from one project to the next, It's similar to a manufacturing process where you're producing the same product over and over again. You want to control variation in the process to produce the same product every time. A defined process has the advantage of being predictable and providing control over changes in scope, schedule, and costs. But its weakness is that it can be very inflexible and not work well in environments where the requirements are uncertain and likely to change. The emphasis on control can also create some unnecessary overhead. An empirical process like Scrum is based on continuous improvement and uses what's called an empirical process control model. The word empirical means based on observation, and in this context it means that both the process and the result are adjusted as needed based on observation throughout the process rather than remaining fixed. Scrum provides a general process framework, but it is a very general process framework that can be easily adapted to different kinds of projects. And within a given project, it is adaptive to projects with highly uncertain requirements. In a Scrum project, changes to requirements are encouraged as the project progresses to maximize the business value of what is produced. The advantage of an empirical process like Scrum is that it is very adaptive to uncertain and changing requirements, and it may also have less overhead and faster time to market. The disadvantage is that because changes are encouraged rather than limited, there is less predictability over the costs and schedule of the project. A very important point, however, is that this is not an all-or-nothing choice between a process that is totally planned and defined with rigid control and a process that is totally unplanned with no control. The right solution is generally between those two extremes, and it is possible to create a hybrid approach to achieve the best of both worlds. Here's a summary of some of the potential benefits of the Scrum framework. First, by using an incremental development approach and prioritizing the items to be developed, Scrum offers the potential to deliver more business value sooner. Scrum is also very focused on higher quality, both in terms of fewer defects and in terms of user satisfaction, because the team takes ownership for the quality of the products that they produce, and the stakeholders and users are actively engaged throughout the project to provide feedback and inputs. Scrum also provides a much higher level of transparency to the development effort and greater visibility of the progress being made, which will ultimately help to keep the project on the right track and reduce the risk in a project. Next, by relying heavily on empowered teams, Scrum provides improved productivity. However, it is not at the expense of project discipline. Scrum provides a fairly disciplined framework for the team to know how to guide the whole project. And next, relying on empowered cross-functional teams also results in stronger teams and much better morale, not only within the development team itself, but within the company as a whole, because everyone feels a part of the effort and can see progress and results quickly. And finally, through a focus on producing value and eliminating unnecessary overhead, as well as a focus on ongoing process improvement, Scrum provides much higher levels of efficiency with less waste. In the next lecture, I've provided some more detailed background information on how Scrum works. That lecture is optional and can be skipped by anyone who is already familiar with how Scrum works. Here's a brief high-level overview of how the Scrum process works. Scrum starts with at least a vision of what the project or product development effort will produce. That vision statement may or may not be detailed and is intended to be further elaborated and defined as the project progresses. The vision statement is expanded into a product backlog, which is a list of user stories that will be needed to fulfill that vision. A user story is a very short and succinct description of a specific item of user functionality. The product backlog is very dynamic and is also expected to be further defined and elaborated as the project progresses. One important aspect of the product backlog is that it is prioritized in terms of business value so that the highest value items get developed first in order to deliver value as quickly as possible. The heart of the Scrum process is a sprint. That's where the actual development work gets done. A sprint in Scrum is a fixed interval of time and is typically 2 to 4 weeks long. Prior to the beginning of each sprint, the items to be developed in that sprint are selected from the product backlog and moved into the sprint backlog. During the sprint, the Scrum team meets daily in what is called the Daily Scrum to review progress, coordinate the team's activities, and to discuss and remove any obstacles that might be impeding progress. At the conclusion of the sprint, a sprint review meeting is held to review and accept the deliverables that were produced by the team during that sprint, and finally the deliverables that are accepted are deployed to production if possible. Scrum consists of three primary roles. The product owner is responsible for the overall success or failure of the project and is the final decision maker on defining and prioritizing requirements. The role is similar to a product manager or project manager. However, it goes beyond the role of a normal project manager because the product owner has decision-making authority on what the product should be. The product owner is focused more on the what than the how. The Scrum Master is more focused on the how and is responsible for facilitating the team, managing the process, and removing impediments. The Scrum Master has some functions that might be similar to a project manager in leading the team, but it is much more of a facilitation role than a more directive leadership role. The Scrum Master is considered a servant leader. Finally, the development team is responsible for developing the solution and is cross-functional and self-organizing. Each member of the development team has some functions that might be considered a very limited form of project management. Each member of the team is responsible for planning and managing their own tasks and reporting progress, and the team as a whole is responsible for coordinating the work that is done by all members of the team. The project management functions that might normally be done by a single individual called a project manager in a traditional plan-driven project are distributed among the three roles, and the emphasis has shifted from a focus on controlling the project to managing costs and schedules to a focus on maximizing the business value of the solution. This diagram shows the major elements of a Scrum process. The product backlog is a prioritized queue of features to be developed that is typically expressed in incremental units of functionality called user stories. The product backlog is continuously refined, prioritized, and clarified as the project progresses in a process called product backlog grooming. You can visualize this process like an iceberg. Requirements start out at the bottom of the iceberg, and at that point they may be defined only at a high level without much detail. As requirements move up to the top of the iceberg, they become more well-defined using a just-in-time process so that a sufficient number of defined requirements are ready to start the development process prior to the beginning of each sprint. A general rule of thumb is that the top of the product backlog has sufficient requirements ready for development for about 2 to 3 sprints in advance. The purpose of that is to avoid the situation where the development team winds up waiting for stories to be defined before they can start a sprint. The heart of a Scrum process is the sprint. That is where the work gets done. A Scrum project is broken up into sprints, which are typically fixed length intervals of time that are 2 to 4 weeks long. The work is time-boxed. In a traditional plan-driven project, the length of the time is expanded to fit the work to be done. In a Scrum project, the length of the sprint is typically fixed, and the work to be done is limited to the capacity of work that the team can accomplish in a single sprint. At the beginning of each sprint, the product owner prioritizes the user stories to be considered for inclusion in the sprint, and the team commits to the functionality that can be done in the sprint based on their estimated velocity and capacity. The sprint backlog is a subset of the overall product backlog and consists of the items that the team has committed to include in the current sprint. It is drawn from the product backlog at the beginning of the sprint. During the sprint, there's a daily stand-up meeting every day to review progress, coordinate work in progress, and resolve any issues. These meetings are typically limited to 15 minutes each, and they are typically done with the entire team standing up to encourage keeping the meeting short. Because these meetings are done daily, any problems or issues that might impact successful completion of the sprint are discovered quickly and resolved. During the sprint, the team meets with the product owner and users to clarify requirements if necessary and to demonstrate partially completed work for feedback and inputs. At the end of every sprint, there's a sprint review meeting to review and accept the work completed in the sprint, which provides timely feedback from both the product owner and potential stakeholders and users. The sprint review is similar to a user acceptance test, or UAT, in a full-scale plan-driven project. At the end of every sprint, there's also a sprint retrospective meeting to review what went well and what didn't go well in the sprint from a process perspective, and improvements are made in the process as necessary prior to the next sprint. The sprint retrospective at the end of each sprint is similar to a post-mortem in a full-scale project. However, because it occurs on very short intervals of time of approximately 2 to 4 weeks each, learning and improvement can take place very rapidly. In the next lecture, we're going to provide a quick overview of how a hybrid Agile process would work. Scrum is an excellent process, but it really only defines a process for a team-level and sprint-level process. It doesn't specify any additional layers of management that might be needed on top of it for larger, more complex projects. That might be sufficient for small single-team projects, but other layers of planning and management might be needed to scale a simple single-team project to a larger scope and complexity. In many cases, for larger and more complex projects, it is essential to add additional layers of planning to the project. Most Scrum projects will have at least some level of project-level planning, where at least the high-level goals and objectives of the project are defined. However, project-level planning can be as thick or thin as necessary, depending on the nature of the project. The project-level planning forms an envelope around the team and sprint-level planning processes defined by Scrum. However, the project-level planning would typically be at least somewhat dynamic. Rather than defining a rigid upfront plan that might not change for the entire duration of the project, it would be expected that lessons learned from the team and sprint-level planning process would be fed back into the project-level planning process to make adjustments to the project-level plan as necessary. In addition to the project-level planning for large complex projects, you might also need to break up the project into releases, and an additional level of release planning might be necessary. The release planning also can be as thick or thin as necessary, but would typically define the high-level capabilities to include in each release, and would also estimate the time required to produce a release. As I've mentioned, it is very possible to blend a plan-driven approach with an Agile approach to create different levels of agility as shown here. It is primarily a matter of putting the right level of emphasis on the different levels of planning in the project. At one extreme, a highly adaptive approach might be limited to team-level planning only, with little or no release-level planning or project-level planning. At the other extreme, a more plan-driven approach would put a much higher level of emphasis on project-level planning and release-level planning. By adjusting the levels of emphasis on planning at each of those levels, it is very possible to create a broad range of hybrid Agile approaches with different levels of agility and adaptivity. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about a couple of examples of applying Agile principles and practices to real-world projects. In this lecture, I want to talk about a couple of simple examples to show you how to apply these principles and practices in the real world. The first example is a project that didn't work so well. I think you can learn just as much or more from projects that didn't work well as those that did work well. The project involved a company that does software development for other companies. The development company contracted with a client company to develop a very large and complex website for them. The client company wasn't very experienced in doing software development, yet they were very demanding and insisted on a fixed-price contract for the effort, with penalty clauses for failing to complete the project on a defined schedule. The project requirements were only defined at a high level to establish the contract, and 6 to 9 months into the project was way behind schedule, and each side was blaming the other for the lack of progress. The development company said that their developers could not make progress without more clearly defined requirements, and blamed the client company for not being responsive to the need for further defining and elaborating the project requirements as the project progressed. The client company was relatively naive about this kind of project and blamed the development company for not meeting the contractual requirements to deliver a solution to them. This is a perfect example of the need for a hybrid approach that combined the client's interests of having some level of predictability over the cost and schedule of the project with the development company's interests of recognizing the level of uncertainty in the project. There are several important lessons that can be learned from this. The first is that many companies make the mistake of force-fitting a project to either a traditional plan-driven model or an Agile model because they see it as a binary and mutually exclusive choice between the two and don't recognize the possibility of using a hybrid approach. This problem becomes compounded when there isn't even a mutual understanding between the client and the project team of how the project will be managed. And finally, an agile or adaptive approach cannot be successful without a spirit of trust and partnership between the client, customer, and the project team. If the customer and the project team can't work together in a spirit of close collaboration, the project is likely to fail. Here's another example from my own experience. I published 5 books in the past 10 years, and I could not have done that without using a somewhat agile or adaptive approach. When you begin to write a book, you typically have some basic ideas, and you further elaborate those ideas as you write the book. I don't think many people start out to write a book with a detailed outline of what the book will be, and even if they did, it might not turn out to be a very good book. I did several key things in writing my last 3 books on Agile project management. I started out with a general idea of what I wanted to accomplish with the book, and further elaborated those ideas as I wrote the book. I engaged a team of people over the internet to give me feedback and inputs as the book progressed. And I used an incremental and iterative approach to write the book a chapter at a time, and as each chapter was written, I sent it out to the team of people I had engaged to give me feedback and inputs to see if it was going on the right track. If I had taken a more traditional plan-driven approach to writing the book and tried to develop a detailed outline and plan for the book before I even got started, the book probably would never have gotten off the ground. If I didn't engage a team of people to provide feedback and inputs as the book progressed, I doubt that the book would have been as successful as it was. If I hadn't broken up the task of writing the book into an incremental and iterative effort of doing a chapter at a time, I probably wouldn't have made much progress. As my book writing skills have improved over the years, however, I've become more sophisticated and actually use more of a hybrid approach. I start out with at least a loosely defined plan for the book and some idea of how it will be structured, but that plan and structure are not absolutely rigid and gets modified as I make progress on writing the book. In the next lecture, we're going to recap some of the topics we've talked about in this course and talk about additional resources that you can use to make further progress in this area. Here's an overall summary of what we've talked about in this course. When people talk about Waterfall, they're generally really talking about a broad range of plan-driven approaches. The word Agile also has a very broad meaning, and it is more of a way of thinking based on the Agile Manifesto rather than a specific methodology like Scrum. However, in today's world, many people heavily associate the word Agile with the Scrum methodology because it is so widely used. To avoid that confusion, I prefer to use the word adaptive rather than agile as a more general term to describe a range of approaches. Another key point is that these approaches are not mutually exclusive, and it is very possible to blend these two approaches together in the right proportions to fit a given situation. Each of these approaches has advantages and disadvantages depending on the situation, and we should think of them as complementary to each other rather than competitive. Many people make the mistake of seeing Agile and Waterfall as binary and mutually exclusive choices in an attempt to force their projects and business environment to one of those extremes, and that can cause a lot of confusion and consternation because it often doesn't result in a good fit. A better solution is to fit the approach or combination of approaches to the project and to the business environment. That may require more skill, but it definitely can be done, and that's exactly the objective of the rest of my Agile project management courses in this curriculum. I want to reiterate a point that I made at the beginning of the course. I'm very receptive to hearing from students, and I will respond to any questions you might have. There are two ways that you can post questions. If you have a question that you think will be of general interest to other students, please post it as a discussion topic with this course. Otherwise, feel free to send me an email directly. Either way, I will do my best to respond to your questions as quickly as possible. That's the end of the course, but before we wrap up, I want to give you a few tips for continuing to develop your learning in this area. First, this course is only intended to be a basic primer for my other Agile project management courses. There are a total of 5 other courses at this time that go into much more depth in all of these areas. I hope this course has whet your appetite to learn more, and I also hope you recognize that becoming a fully proficient Agile project manager is a significant challenge and a journey. And one simple short course like this is only the beginning of that journey. For those who are interested in learning more, I've included a bonus lecture at the end of the course that includes more information on more than 60 free blog articles I've written, 3 books I've published in this area, and the complete Agile project management training curriculum I've developed consisting of 5 other courses. I've also included references to discount coupons for all of the rest of my courses. I also want to make you aware of another course we offer for business managers. The course is essentially a condensed version of the primary 7 courses for Agile project managers. The intended audience for the course is Agile product owners or product managers who need to better understand how to effectively perform the Agile product owner role. The product owner role in Agile is not well understood, and most of the people who might be selected to perform that role are not well prepared for what it requires. And next is business analysts who work in an Agile environment and need to optimize their skills to provide a high level of value in that environment. And also business sponsors who want to learn more about Agile project management in order to provide more effective leadership for the initiatives that they are responsible for. And finally, senior-level executives who are interested in making their business more agile and want to develop a well-integrated approach to fit an agile development process to their business. The idea behind this course is that Agile requires a collaborative relationship between the project team and business managers based on a mutual understanding of the Agile process. The course is designed to help develop that collaborative relationship. Thank you very much for taking the time to take this course. I hope that it has been helpful to you. I am very interested in all of my students, so please keep me informed of your progress in implementing these ideas and let me know if I can help in any way. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this course. It's a short course, and as I've mentioned, it's only intended as a basic primer for my other courses. I hope it has given you the catalyst to want to learn more, and there certainly is a lot more to learn. In this lecture, I want to make you aware of some of the other materials I've developed to help you continue the learning that you've started in this course and to put these ideas into action. The primary audience for my training is project managers. However, an important trend with Agile is to distribute the function of project management and make it an integral part of the functions of the whole Agile team. So there are actually many people who will benefit from this training that might not have the formal title of project manager. Agile is really raising the bar for the entire project management profession, in my opinion. At one time, all you had to do was get a PMP and you were a well-qualified project manager. Over the past few years, PMI has recognized the need for project managers to have at least some awareness of Agile and Lean and created the Agile Certified Practitioner certification. That's definitely a step in the right direction, but it doesn't go far enough in my opinion. The real challenge is learning how to blend Agile and traditional plan-driven project management principles and practices in the right proportions to fit a given situation. That's exactly the challenge my courses are designed to address for project managers. The courses I've developed are not only excellent preparation for the PMI-ACP exam, but they also go well beyond that and help project managers learn how to put that knowledge into practice in a real-world Agile project management role. This slide shows where this course fits into the overall Agile project management roadmap that I've developed. I have developed a total of 7 courses in this series on Agile project management. This is the first course in that series, and it serves as a primer to all of the other courses. The overall curriculum provides a very complete Agile project management training program that is designed around enabling a project manager to successfully blend an Agile and traditional plan-driven project management approach in the right proportions to fit any given situation. In addition to these 7 primary courses, there is an optional course that is designed to supplement these courses called How to Prepare for PMI-ACP Certification. That course is designed specifically for anyone who wants to use these courses for PMI-ACP certification. It is also a great way to review the material in the primary 7 courses and tie it all together, even if you have no interest in PMI-ACP certification. Any student who completes the overall curriculum of all 7 of these courses will receive a signed completion certificate from the Agile Project Management Academy, similar to the one shown here. I always offer discounts to existing students to take any of my additional courses. You will find the latest discount coupons for all of my courses on the links shown on this slide. For your convenience, I've included a special text lesson immediately following this one with these links. All of the courses are offered on 2 different platforms, through Udemy and the Agile Project Management Academy. The courses on the 2 platforms are identical, and the pricing and coupons are almost exactly the same. The primary difference is that I am able to offer a bundled price on all courses through the Agile Project Management Academy, while Udemy does not currently provide that capability. These courses have also received excellent feedback from students. Students really like the pragmatic real-world approach of these courses, and it is a real breakthrough for many students to learn how to blend Agile and traditional plan-driven project management, rather than seeing those 2 areas as competitive and mutually exclusive with each other. In addition to my courses, I also have a blog site that has over 100 useful articles to address particular topics in this area, and I am continuing to expand that all the time. You can find that blog site at managedagile.com. And of course, I want to emphasize that I am always very responsive to questions and inquiries from students, so if you need help in any way, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video, and I look forward to working with you in the rest of my courses.